I took the trip because I needed to get away from people. Everything had started piling up. Work, bills, noise, the constant nagging feeling that life was getting out of my hands. My days blurred together. I worked in a windowless office, sat in traffic every day, and barely slept. I wasn't happy. I wasn't miserable either, just stuck in that middle ground where nothing feels right. A coworker of mine had mentioned a cabin his cousin owned. It wasn't listed online, just a simple place up in the Adirondacks that people used every now and then. No cell service, no internet, no neighbors. I asked for the contact info and booked it for 4 nights. The drive took most of the day. I had to stop for gas twice. The last stretch was on gravel roads, winding up into thicker woods than I'd seen in years. I passed a closed general store, an old church with a collapsing roof, and a wooden sign that said Mill Creek Road nailed to a tree. After a few more miles, I pulled off where the GPS lost signal and followed a narrow path into the trees until I found the gate. The cabin was about 100 yards from where I parked. I had to carry my gear in 2 trips. The path was overgrown, wet with melted snow, and surrounded by nothing but trees. Not a single power line, not even birds chirping. The place looked fine, simple but solid. 1 story, a wraparound porch, a stovepipe chimney, and a roof sagging a little in the middle. It sat beside a dried-up creek bed and was tucked low enough in the valley that you couldn't see it until you were right in front of it. I unlocked the door with the key I was mailed and stepped inside. The smell hit first. Old wood, mildew, and faint smoke. Not rotten, but old. Everything inside was made of heavy timber. There was a small table, a bench, a cot, a wood stove in the corner, and a counter with a hand pump for water. A row of cabinets, all empty except for some mismatched utensils, an old tin pan, and a rusted can opener. The first night passed quietly. I lit a fire, heated up a can of soup, and read by the flashlight until I got tired. The cot was stiff but usable. The woods outside made a constant whispering sound, branches swaying, leaves brushing against each other. Around midnight, I heard something knock against the porch. Not a person knock, just a sound. A thud, like something dropped or shifted. I waited a while, flashlight in hand, and chalked it up to wind or an animal. I didn't sleep well after that. The next morning, I walked the area. The land dipped behind the cabin, forming a narrow trail that led down to what used to be a pond. There were old footprints frozen into the mud along the edge, but they looked like they'd been there weeks. I saw a deer bolt across the ridge, its white tail flashing. I took that as a good sign that the area wasn't totally empty. That night, I set up a small fire pit out back. I sat there for hours watching the trees go dark. There was no moon. Everything outside the firelight was pitch black. At some point, I heard something moving behind the tree-line. Not close, but steady, moving in a half-circle around me. I thought it might be a bear. I killed the fire and went inside. The next day, I woke up and found footprints on the porch. Bare feet. Human. The mud must have been soft from the frost melting. The prints were narrow, long, and spaced like someone had walked slowly back and forth in front of the door. They weren't mine. I hadn't gone out barefoot. I stood there for a long time just staring at them. I tried to make sense of it. Maybe someone local had wandered through. Maybe a hiker got lost and passed by. I looked around but didn't see any other signs. No trash, no broken branches, no tracks leading off the porch. The prints started at the edge of the stairs and stopped at the door. I didn't know what to do, so I swept them away with a stick and stayed inside most of the day. That evening, I didn't start a fire outside. I kept the curtains closed and only lit a small candle near the stove. I sat by the window for hours listening. It was dead quiet. Not even wind this time. The kind of silence that makes your ears ring. Sometime around 1 a.m., I heard the porch creak. A slow step, then another. I held my breath. My heart was pounding. The footsteps stopped. I leaned toward the window, slowly, and peeked through a slit in the curtain. The moon had finally come out, just enough light to make out the porch. There was a man standing there. No shirt, no shoes. Just dark pants and long, tangled hair that hung around his face. He didn't move. He just stood there, facing the door, arms at his sides. I didn't move either. I stayed frozen in place for what felt like forever. Then he stepped forward, slowly, and leaned his head against the door. I could hear it, his forehead pressing against the wood. A faint sound, like breathing through his nose. I backed away, silently, and grabbed the hatchet I had by the stove. I didn't speak. I didn't make a sound. After a few minutes, the breathing stopped. I waited. I counted to 300 in my head. I crept back to the window and looked again. He was gone. I didn't sleep. I sat in the corner with the hatchet in my lap, listening to every creak of the cabin, every shift of the wind. When morning finally came, I stepped outside. There were no tracks this time. The ground had frozen again overnight. The sun was low, barely cutting through the trees. I packed, threw everything into my bag, and decided I was leaving a day early. I didn't care about the lost money or the time. I just wanted to get back to my car and drive until I saw a gas station or a diner or anything human. The hike back felt twice as long. I didn't look behind me, but I kept hearing something in the woods. Branches snapping, leaves rustling. Always behind me, never ahead. I tried to keep calm, but I ended up jogging the last half mile. When I got to the car, something was off. There were smudges on the back window.
Palm prints.
Not full hands, just smears, like someone had pressed their fingers against the glass and dragged them downward. The doors were still locked. Nothing broken, but I knew it hadn't been like that before. I got in, locked the doors, and drove until I was back in cell range. I called a friend, told him I was cutting the trip short, and stayed in a motel that night. The next morning, I went home. It's been 9 months. I haven't told many people about what happened. I tried to convince myself it was just some drifter, someone living off the grid. But deep down, it feels like more than that. Not supernatural, not a monster, just someone out there. A man, maybe more than one, living so deep in the woods that they aren't part of the world anymore. People like that exist. You read about them sometimes, hermits, fugitives, off-the-grid survivalists. They know the land better than anyone. They can move through trees without making a sound. They don't leave trash, don't light fires, don't want to be seen. And when someone stumbles too close to where they live, maybe they follow them back. Maybe they wait outside. Maybe they watch to see if they're a threat. Maybe they don't always just watch. That thought still gets to me. I haven't gone camping since. I don't plan to. I check the locks twice now, keep a flashlight beside my bed, and sometimes I wake up convinced I've heard footsteps outside. Usually there's nothing, but sometimes, just sometimes, I find smudges on my windows, and I don't live near the woods. I needed a break from everything: work, traffic, noise, people. I wasn't sleeping much, and my apartment always felt cramped, like the walls were closing in a little more each night. It had been years since I'd taken more than a long weekend for myself, so I booked a cabin. I found it through a listing site, simple, out in the woods, about a 5-hour drive north. No Wi-Fi, no cell signal, no distractions. That was the point. I wanted quiet. I wanted to sit on a porch with a cup of coffee and hear nothing but the wind and birds. I didn't need luxury. I needed space. The drive there was peaceful. I left early in the morning before sunrise. By the time the sun came up, I was halfway there, passing through small towns that looked like they hadn't changed in 50 years. After a while, the towns disappeared, and it was just trees and old power lines. The last stretch was a gravel road that climbed into the forest. I followed the directions I'd printed out since I wouldn't have service. The road narrowed as it went deeper. Trees leaned in close. Branches scraped the sides of my car. Eventually, I saw it, the cabin. It was older than I expected. 2 stories of dark wood, the paint long since faded. The porch sagged a little, and the windows looked like they hadn't been washed in a decade. There was a shed off to one side, half covered in vines. A small clearing opened up around the building, maybe 50 feet of grass before the trees started again. It was quiet. No traffic, no people. Just what I needed. I parked next to the porch and got out. The air smelled clean, like pine and earth. Felt cool even though it was late spring. I unlocked the door with the key the owner had mailed me and stepped inside. The inside was simple: a narrow kitchen, a small living room, and a staircase leading upstairs. Everything smelled faintly of old wood and dust. The furniture was worn but clean. There was a fireplace and a stack of chopped wood next to it. I dropped my bag near the couch and walked through each room. No surprises. Upstairs were 2 bedrooms, both with old beds and heavy wool blankets. The bathroom had an actual clawfoot tub, which I hadn't seen outside of movies. No shower, but I didn't mind. I wasn't in a rush for anything. I spent the first day settling in. I unpacked the groceries I brought, filled the old mini fridge, and put my clothes in the bedroom drawer. I didn't do much else. I sat on the porch until it got too dark to see. I could hear insects and the occasional owl. That night, I built a fire in the fireplace and just sat there, listening to the crackle and pop of the wood. I felt my whole body relax. I fell asleep on the couch without meaning to. The next morning, I woke early. I walked the woods a little, not too far. Just wanted to get a feel for the area. It was beautiful, thick trees, moss on the rocks, damp earth under my boots. I saw deer prints near a small stream and birds I'd never seen before. I didn't see another person, which was exactly what I wanted. That afternoon, I was sitting out on the porch, drinking coffee, when I saw it. A dog, big, brown and black, short-haired, looked like a shepherd mix, came out of the woods across the clearing and just stood there, staring at me. I didn't move. It didn't either. Its tail wasn't wagging, but it didn't growl or bark. It just stood there, like it was waiting. Eventually, it turned and walked back into the trees. I watched the woods for another hour, but it didn't come back. That night, I locked the doors, not because of the dog, but because I always do. The fire kept the place warm, and I went to bed early. I didn't hear anything strange. The next morning, there were paw prints on the porch. Big ones. The boards creaked when I stepped outside, and I followed the prints across the porch and into the grass. They circled the house once, maybe twice, and then disappeared into the woods again. I didn't know if it was the same dog or another. I didn't hear barking, and I didn't see any signs of people nearby. I figured it was a stray or maybe from some cabin farther out. Still, something about the way it moved the day before stuck with me. It didn't seem wild, but it didn't seem friendly either. It was alert, watching like it was measuring me. The rest of the day was quiet. I read a book, took another walk, cooked some rice and beans. I kept the axe from the woodpile inside, near the door, not because I was afraid, but just in case. When you're out in the woods alone, you think more carefully about things like that. That night, around midnight, I woke up suddenly. I didn't know why. The cabin was silent. I sat up in bed, listening. Then I heard it, a low sound like scratching. It was coming from downstairs. I stayed still, heart thudding in my chest. It came again, scratching, dragging, something moving slowly across the porch. I got out of bed, barefoot, and crept to the top of the stairs. I leaned over the banister and listened. The sound was on the porch, not inside. Something heavy brushed against the front door. Then it stopped. I waited a long time before moving. I went back to bed but didn't sleep. At dawn, I opened the front door. More paw prints, deep ones. The dog had come back. It scratched the door, for long marks ran down the wood. It had pressed against it, hard enough that the door frame creaked when I opened it. I didn't go for a walk that day. I kept the axe by my side. I sat on the porch for a while, scanning the tree line. Nothing moved. Nothing made a sound. Even the birds were quiet. Around 4 in the afternoon, I saw it again. Same dog, standing just inside the tree line, halfway around the cabin. Watching, I stood slowly and took a step off the porch. It didn't move. I walked toward it slowly, 20 feet, then 30. It just watched me, its eyes locked on mine. I noticed then that it wasn't panting. Its mouth was closed, its body still. It looked strong, muscular. Its coat was dirty, matted around the chest and neck. I stopped maybe 40 feet from it. It took one step back, still watching, then turned and vanished into the woods. I didn't follow. I went back inside and didn't come out the rest of the day. That night, I dragged one of the armchairs in front of the front door. I locked both deadbolts and kept the axe close. I didn't make a fire. I didn't want any light. I lay awake in bed, fully dressed. Around 2 a.m., it came back. The boards creaked under its weight. Scratched the door again, slow and long. Not like it was trying to get in, but like it wanted me to know it was there. Then it walked the length of the porch, its claws clicking softly against the wood, around the side of the cabin to the back. I heard its weight pressing against the walls. It moved slow, deliberate. I didn't sleep. In the morning, I checked the back door. More paw prints, mud on the glass, smears from its fur where it had rubbed against the wall. I stayed inside all day. I didn't eat. I barely drank water. I kept all the windows shut, all the blinds down. Every creak of the wood made me flinch. That night, it didn't come, nor the night after that. I started to think maybe it had moved on. On the 5th day, I risked a walk just around the cabin. I saw where it had lain in the grass near the edge of the clearing. A patch of flattened grass, shaped like a large body, had been resting there for hours. There was fur stuck to a stump nearby. Coarse, dark, too coarse to be from a normal house dog. I started counting the days until I could leave. I had a week left on the rental, but I didn't care. I just wanted out. I packed what I could quickly and planned to leave at sunrise. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing sounds, soft ones like breathing, just outside the window. I didn't look. I didn't want to see it again. At first light, I loaded my car and left. The gravel road felt longer than before. Every shadow between the trees looked like it could be hiding something. I didn't stop until I reached the highway. I never went back. I don't know what that dog was or what it wanted. Maybe it was just a stray, curious about me. Maybe it was something else. All I know is that I've never felt watched like that before. Not by an animal. Not by anything. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear the scratching. I needed to get away from everything for a while. Work had been eating at me, day in and day out, and city life was starting to wear me down in a way I didn't even notice until one day I woke up exhausted despite 8 hours of sleep. I didn't want to talk to anyone. I didn't want to look at my phone. I didn't want to think about meetings, emails, or the news. I just wanted out. I remembered this cabin my cousin had mentioned once, out near the Canadian border, deep in the woods. It was more like a hunting shack than a proper cabin, but it had 4 walls, a roof, and it was isolated. That was good enough for me. I got the directions from him in a short email. The place wasn't listed anywhere. No website, no pictures. Just a set of rough turns and a few notes about a gas station I should fill up at because there was nothing for miles after that. I threw together some gear, food, water, my sleeping bag, some tools, and a few books. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. I just told work I needed time off and left it at that. The drive took most of a day. I headed north, past the last towns and into the wooded back roads. The highway disappeared behind me and the dirt roads ahead were barely marked. I followed the directions closely, watching for hand-painted signs and landmarks like a rusted-out truck with no wheels, or a tree split in half by lightning. Eventually, the path narrowed to the point where the branches scratched both sides of my SUV. That's when I knew I was getting close. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, I cut the engine and just sat there. It was quiet, not the kind of quiet you get in parks or on quiet streets. This was the kind of quiet where you could hear your heartbeat if you listened close. No birds, no wind, just stillness. The cabin looked just like I expected. Old. 1 room, a tiny front porch with 2 broken chairs. The wood was gray from time and weather, and the roof sagged in the middle, but it looked solid. It would do. I brought my things inside. There wasn't much in the way of furniture. A cot, a small table, and a couple of shelves that held a few dusty cans and some half-melted candles. There was a wood stove in the corner and a small pile of firewood beside it. No electricity, no plumbing, just 4 walls and a door. I liked it. It was perfect. I spent the first couple of days getting used to the place. I gathered some dry firewood, boiled water from a stream nearby, and cooked simple meals on the stove. The days were long, but they felt good. I slept better than I had in months, the kind of sleep where you forget what time it is and don't care when you wake up. I sat on the porch for hours, just watching the trees. It wasn't until the fourth day that things started to feel a little off. I was out behind the cabin, walking the woods like I usually did, when I noticed something strange. A tree, a thick birch, had been cut down. Not by age or storm. It had been chopped, clean and deliberate. The stump was fresh, the cut smooth. That wouldn't be strange, except there was no reason for anyone else to be out here. This place was supposed to be completely isolated. I hadn't seen or heard another human being since I arrived. I looked around but saw nothing. No boot prints, no tracks, just that stump, sitting there like a question with no answer. I shrugged it off. Maybe it had been cut a while ago, and the stump just looked fresh. Maybe someone had been here last season. The woods played tricks on you if you let them. That night, I woke up cold. The fire had burned low. I got up to add more wood, and when I looked out the small window, I froze. There was something standing at the edge of the clearing, just outside the trees. I couldn't make out what it was. It wasn't moving. Just a dark shape, tall and narrow, like a person maybe, or a post. I stared for a long time. It didn't move. Eventually, I told myself it was just a tree trunk or a shadow. I went back to bed and pulled the blanket over my head like a kid. In the morning, I went out there. There was nothing. No tracks. No tree in the spot I'd seen it. Just grass and brush. That's when I started feeling it in my gut. That low hum of unease. I've been fine all week. Happy even. But now the woods felt different. Like they were watching. I spent the day around the cabin. I didn't go walking. I kept the axe close. Nothing happened. No sounds. No movement. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. That night, I bolted the door and put the axe beside my sleeping bag. I didn't sleep much. Around 2 in the morning, I heard footsteps. Not animals. Not leaves rustling. Footsteps. Slow, steady, circling the cabin. I held my breath, not daring to move. The sound circled twice, then stopped. Silence. I don't know how long I stayed like that. An hour, maybe. More. Eventually, I must have dozed off because the next thing I knew, it was morning. I walked the perimeter. No prints. No signs. Nothing. But the grass was flattened in places, like someone had stood there a long time, just watching. The 5th day, I made the decision to leave. I packed up everything and loaded it into the car. But when I turned the key, the engine didn't even click. Dead. I checked everything I could. Batteries seemed fine. Fuses too. But it wouldn't turn over. I wasn't a mechanic, but I'd never had trouble with the car before. I tried again and again. Nothing. I didn't like the idea of walking out. It was easily 15 miles to the nearest road. Maybe more. But I wasn't about to spend another night there. I started walking. I kept a steady pace and didn't stop much. I followed the trail I came in on, checking my landmarks. After 3 hours, I realized something was wrong. I passed the same rusted truck I used as a marker when I came in. The same one. There was no way I had looped back. I'd gone in a straight line. But here it was. I stood there, breathing hard, trying to think. I knew the way. I hadn't made a wrong turn. But somehow I had ended up back where I started. I turned around and walked the other way, faster this time. An hour later, I came to the same tree split by lightning. My legs were aching, and I felt panic start to creep in. I went back to the cabin. The sun was starting to set, and the shadows were stretching long and thin across the clearing. I built a fire and sat with my back to the wall. I didn't sleep. At some point in the night, the noises came back. Footsteps, closer this time. I heard breathing, deep and slow, just outside the window. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. The breathing stopped. Then something scraped the wood. A long, slow drag like a nail or a blade. I gripped the axe so hard my hands went numb. Then silence. When morning came, I opened the door and found something nailed to it. A piece of wood, broken off a tree, sharpened on one end, stuck into the center of the door like a warning. I didn't know what to do. I tried the car again. Nothing. I considered heading into the woods and just walking straight, ignoring the trail, hoping to find help. But if I was getting turned around on a marked path, what chance did I have cutting through the forest? I stayed another night. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I started marking my trail. Every few minutes, I would carve an arrow into a tree with my knife. Deep, obvious marks pointing the way I came. I walked all day, slowly, carefully. I ignored the noises I heard in the woods. Snapping twigs, distant breathing, things that might have been animals or not. At dusk, I looked back. The last tree I marked was blank. No arrow, just smooth bark. I walked back to the previous tree. No mark. I checked the one before that. Nothing. I turned in a circle, my heart pounding. They were gone. I ran. I didn't care where I ended up. I ran until my legs gave out, until I collapsed in the dirt, gasping. I don't know how long I was out. When I woke up, it was dark, and the cabin was right in front of me. I stumbled inside and locked the door. I stayed there for 2 more days. I ran out of food. The stream dried up. The firewood dwindled. I didn't hear footsteps anymore, just the sound of wind, low and constant, like breathing. On the 3rd morning, I heard a car. A real car. I ran outside, barefoot, and screamed. A ranger stood beside his truck, staring at me with wide eyes. He asked if I was okay. I couldn't speak. I just nodded. He drove me back to town. I didn't tell him everything, just that I got lost and my car died. He didn't ask questions. Maybe he knew. I had the car towed. They never found anything wrong with it. It started the first time they tried. I never went back to that cabin. Never asked about it again. I moved to a different city. Started over. Sometimes late at night, I still hear that breathing. And when I wake up, I always check the door. I rented a cabin deep in the woods of northern Washington because I needed to be alone. That's what I told myself when I booked it. I had been burned out, stuck in a loop of deadlines, noise, and city habits I couldn't shake. My job didn't mean much to me anymore, but I was still doing it every day, every week without fail. My body was tired. My head was full. I needed something that felt quieter than my apartment and more distant than just taking a walk around the block. I picked a place that was off the grid. No cell signal, no internet, a wood stove for heat, a well pump out back. The photos showed something simple. An old cabin with dark wood walls, a tin roof, and a single narrow porch. There was 1 bedroom, a kitchen with a propane stove, and a bathroom that still used a composting toilet. No neighbors within 10 miles. That was important to me. I didn't want to hear anyone. I didn't want to see anyone. The cabin was listed by an older couple who used to live out there full-time. They had retired to Arizona but still rented it out for solitude seekers like me. I messaged them twice before booking, just to ask about firewood and how often they came back to check the place. They told me the woodshed out back was stocked and that they hadn't been up since early spring. It was September now. Cold nights had already started. I drove up on a Thursday morning. The last 2 hours were all 2-lane roads and gravel turns, winding deeper into forested land. I passed maybe 2 other trucks the whole way. I stopped once to pee on the side of the road and didn't hear a single car for 15 minutes. By the time I reached the long driveway that curled through the trees, I hadn't had cell service for over an hour. The cabin sat in a small clearing. Pines and birches rose around it like walls. There was a small creek off to the left, and an overgrown trail that disappeared into the woods near the back. The air felt sharper there, and even in the afternoon, it smelled like wet moss and wood smoke. I got out and stood still for a while, just listening. Nothing. No hum of cars, no voices, no distant traffic. Just trees rustling a little, the creek trickling faintly, and wind somewhere high in the canopy. I unpacked quickly, just a backpack and a cooler. I brought canned food, dried stuff, matches, a few tools, a flashlight, batteries. I didn't need much. That was the whole point. There was a single bed in the corner with a wool blanket already laid out. A shelf held a few old books. The kitchen was as basic as I expected. Propane stove, hand-pumped sink, cast iron pans. There was a faint smell in the place. Something between mildew and pine, but nothing bad, just old. The first 2 days were calm. I didn't do much. I read. I walked around the clearing. I cooked lentils and rice on the stove. At night, I lit the kerosene lantern and read by its soft yellow glow. It felt good to sit in the stillness. It was what I'd wanted. But by the third night, something started to feel off. It was small things at first, just enough to notice but not enough to act on. I had gone to bed early that night, the wood stove burning low, my body warm under the blanket. At some point past midnight, I woke up suddenly. I didn't know why. I lay still in the dark, eyes open, heart a little fast. The cabin was quiet, like always, but it felt like something had changed. I listened for a long time but didn't hear anything. I figured maybe a branch had fallen or maybe an animal had brushed the side of the cabin. It was woods. Things moved out here. The next morning, I went outside and checked the perimeter. I looked for tracks, broken branches, anything. Nothing stood out. I told myself I was overthinking it. Later that day, while chopping kindling behind the shed, I noticed something strange. One of the logs had been moved from the pile. Not just shifted by wind or accident, but set a few feet away almost carefully. It stood upright, balanced on its cut end. That didn't make sense. I hadn't moved it, and it wasn't the kind of thing wind could do. I looked around again, still nothing. No tracks, no sign of anyone, just quiet woods. That night, I brought the axe inside and laid it near the door. I still wasn't scared, just alert, aware. I didn't sleep great, but nothing else happened. The next morning, I found something else. This time it was in the kitchen. One of the cabinet doors was slightly open. I knew I hadn't left it that way. I was careful about things like that, especially in a place without solid locks. I checked the supplies, nothing was missing. I told myself maybe I had opened it and forgotten. But the feeling in my stomach was different now. Heavier. That weight stayed with me the rest of the day. By the fifth night, I was starting to feel something like fear. Not a sudden kind of panic. More like a slow pressure in my chest that wouldn't go away. I kept thinking about that log, the open cabinet, the cold air slipping under the cabin door at night. Every sound outside felt too loud. Every creak in the walls made me hold my breath. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay on the bed, the axe still beside the door, my flashlight under my pillow. Around 2 a.m., I heard something. It was a dull thump, then another, like footsteps, slow, deliberate, heavy. Not on the porch, on the ground, near the shed. I held my breath and waited. The steps paused. Then I heard a scraping sound, like something dragging across wood. Then silence. I didn't move until daylight. When I finally went outside, the first thing I saw was that the shed door was open. It had been closed and latched the day before. I was sure of it. Inside, things were scattered. Not just moved, but tossed. Tools, rags, an old camp stove, all knocked around. A saw was missing. I checked for prints again, but the ground was too dry. I stayed outside until the sun was high. I didn't want to be in the cabin anymore, but I didn't want to leave either. The idea of walking back to my car through those miles of forest felt worse. I thought about packing up and leaving anyway, but something told me not to yet. I couldn't explain it. Maybe I just wanted to understand what was going on. That evening, I built a fire in the pit outside and sat near it until long after sunset. I watched the trees, the darkness between them. I tried to convince myself it was an animal, a bear maybe, or a curious raccoon. But I knew that wasn't true. This wasn't the way animals acted. This was something else. Around midnight, I heard the crunch of footsteps again, this time closer, maybe 30 feet away, near the trailhead behind the cabin. I turned off the lantern and crouched low. I didn't breathe. The steps moved slowly toward the fire pit. Then they stopped. I couldn't see anything. It was pitch black beyond the edge of the firelight. Then I heard a noise I still can't forget. It was a slow, deep exhale. Human, not a growl, not an animal sound. Just someone breathing out, long and slow, like they'd been holding it. I didn't move. I stayed frozen for what felt like an hour. Eventually, the sound faded. The footsteps backed away. Silence returned. I stayed out there until dawn. The next day, I made a decision. I was leaving. I packed what I could into my bag, stuffed the rest in the cooler, and dragged everything out to the car. I didn't care about the reservation. I didn't care about the money. I just wanted out. But the car wouldn't start. Turned over once, then nothing. I checked the battery connections. Clean. I tried again. Nothing. It was dead. I sat in the driver's seat trying to stay calm. The nearest town was at least 12 miles down the dirt road. I could walk it. I didn't want to, but I could. But I didn't go that day. I stayed one more night, not because I wanted to, but because something told me not to move yet. It wasn't logical. It was just instinct. I pushed a dresser in front of the door and kept the axe in my lap the whole night. There were no sounds that night. No footsteps. No breathing. Just a deep silence that made me feel like whatever had been watching was still there. But waiting. At sunrise, I left. I walked the road for hours. I didn't see a single car. My legs ached. My throat dried out. Eventually, I reached a gas station near the edge of town. I didn't tell the guy behind the counter anything. I just asked for a phone and called a tow. When we got back to the cabin, the driver helped me jump the battery. The car started immediately. He shrugged and said sometimes cold weather messes with old batteries. Maybe he was right. Maybe not. I drove away and never looked back. Weeks later, when I told a friend about it, they said I probably imagined most of it. Stress, isolation, cabin fever. Maybe they were right. But here's the thing. I still have that axe. I keep it in the back of my closet. And I still dream about that sound. That slow breath in the dark, just past the firelight. There was someone out there with me. I know it. I felt it. I heard them. And if I'd stayed one more night, I don't think I'd be here now. I drove up to the cabin because I needed space. Not the kind people say they want during an argument, but actual physical space. Space away from the crowd, the city, the pressure, and the noise. The cabin was my uncle's, though he hadn't used it in years. He told me I could go anytime I needed to clear my head. It sat in the middle of dense woods in northern Idaho, for hours from the nearest town, a place people only went when they wanted to be left alone. The drive took all day. I passed the last gas station just before a 2-hour stretch of nothing but old logging roads, potholes, and trees that seemed to close in tighter the deeper I went. By the time I pulled up to the cabin, it was getting dark. The sky was that deep purple shade just before full black, and the air was colder than I expected. I parked the truck beside a pile of rotted firewood and sat for a second, engine ticking as it cooled. The cabin was small, single-story, with a metal roof and a covered porch leaning slightly to one side. It looked like it hadn't been touched in a long time. Inside, it smelled like dust and pine. The furniture was old but solid. A wood stove sat in the corner of the main room, and a small kitchen sat off to the side. There were 2 bedrooms, both empty except for the beds. I unpacked the essentials. Food, clothes, a rifle my uncle insisted I bring, though I didn't think I'd need it. I made a fire in the stove, heated up some soup, and went to bed without thinking much. The mattress creaked every time I shifted, and the quiet was so thick it pressed on my ears. But I was tired enough not to care. The first few days were uneventful. I walked the trails behind the cabin, chopped some of the drier wood I could find, and spent most of my time reading or writing in a journal. I wanted to be alone, and that's what I got. The forest was still, heavy with the silence that comes only when you're miles from anyone. I didn't see another soul, not even a deer or squirrel, just birds here and there and the occasional rustle in the brush that could have been anything. On the 4th night, I was woken up by a sound. A dull knock, then another. I sat up in bed, heart thudding. It was coming from outside, a slow, rhythmic knock on the porch floorboards. I waited, counted each thud, for 5, 6, then nothing. I got up and looked out the window. The moon was bright, enough to light up the yard in a pale silver, but I didn't see anything. I stood there a while before going back to bed, telling myself it was the wind, maybe a branch tapping against the wall. Still, I locked the door that night. It wasn't locked before. The next morning, I walked around the cabin. No footprints, no signs of anything being disturbed. But I noticed something that hadn't been there before. On the porch, near the steps, was a small pile of rocks. 7 of them, stacked one on top of the other, balanced too neatly to be an accident. I stared at it for a long time, then kicked it over. I didn't know why it bothered me so much, but it did. I didn't like the idea of someone sneaking around the cabin while I slept. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept the fire going and left a lantern burning in the main room. Around 1 a.m., I heard it again. Knock, knock. Then the sound of something brushing against the wall. It moved slowly, like someone dragging a stick along the outside of the cabin. I sat there in the dark, listening, my hand on the rifle. It lasted maybe 10 minutes, then stopped. I didn't go outside. The next day, I found another stack of rocks, this time right outside the kitchen window. Smaller stones, balanced on the windowsill. I didn't touch it. I just stared at it and felt a growing sense of unease in my gut. Someone was out there, watching, waiting, not trying to get in, just letting me know they were around. That afternoon, I packed my gear. I had planned to stay the full week, but I decided to leave the next morning. I was too on edge, too aware of every little sound and movement in the trees. I didn't want to spend another night wondering if someone was out there. I made dinner, locked all the doors, and kept the rifle close. The night passed without sound. No knocking, no rocks, nothing, but I didn't sleep much. At dawn, I loaded up the truck. It was cold and foggy, and the trees dripped with moisture. As I put the last bag in the cab, I noticed something near the back of the cabin. A third stack of rocks. Larger stones, this time arranged in a circle. In the center was a small animal skull. A raccoon maybe, or a fox. Clean, white bone with the jaw still attached. I didn't touch it. I just got in the truck and started driving. The road back felt longer. Every time I hit a bump or rounded a corner, I expected to see someone standing there. I didn't. I made it back to town by mid-afternoon, fueled up, and kept driving until I got home. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I just said the trip was fine, nothing special. Weeks passed. I tried to forget about it. Then, one morning, I found a small stack of stones on the hood of my car. 7 rocks, carefully balanced. No note, no sign of anyone nearby. I swept them off, trying to stay calm. But I started checking the locks more often, closed the blinds at night, started looking over my shoulder when walking alone. Then it happened again. A pile of rocks on my doorstep, then one on my windowsill. Always 7, always neatly arranged. I moved, different town, different state, left no forwarding address. It's been almost a year now. No rocks, no signs. I still don't know who was out there or what they wanted. Maybe it was some backwoods trapper playing games. Maybe someone lives out there and doesn't like visitors. Or maybe it was something else. Not supernatural, just someone patient and cruel who gets off on fear. Whatever it was, I got the message. I don't go into the woods alone anymore, and I haven't been back to that cabin. I never will. I decided to rent a cabin deep in the woods of northern Montana, far from town, far from roads, far from everything. I had been feeling burned out. Work, city life, all of it had worn me thin. I needed a reset, no phone, no computer, just me and nature. The cabin was old but functional. It had no power, only a wood stove, an outhouse a few yards into the trees, and a hand pump for water in the back. It was exactly what I wanted. When I first got there, the air felt clean, quiet. It was that kind of quiet that presses against your ears until you hear your own breathing too loud. I unloaded my gear and stacked my firewood. I brought enough dry food to last a week. My plan was to hike during the days and read or write in the evenings by lantern. The cabin had a journal from previous renters. Most entries were dull weather updates, book recommendations, complaints about the outhouse. On my second night, I heard movement outside. Light shuffling, not close, not loud, but enough to make me sit still. Could have been a deer or raccoon. I reminded myself I was in the woods, after all. Still, I got up and slid the wooden bolt across the door. In the morning, I saw faint footprints in the frost around the pump. Bare feet, no shoes, no boots, just long, narrow, human-like footprints. I stood there staring for a while. My first thought was some backwoods person, maybe a squatter or a hermit. I didn't see any others, but the thought stuck in my brain. I went on a hike that day, trying to shake off the feeling. Every snap of a branch behind me made me spin around. I felt like I was being watched the entire time. I cut the hike short and came back to the cabin mid-afternoon. I checked the pump area again. The prints were still there, even more obvious in the melted frost. I took some photos with my old digital camera and kept it on me the rest of the day. I made a fire in the stove and kept a knife nearby. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I found something worse. On the step outside the cabin was a small carved figure. It looked like it was made from a branch, carved with some kind of blade into a vague human shape. It had no face, just an elongated head and arms scratched into its sides. It looked old, weathered, but I'd never seen it before, and I'd been all around that cabin. I didn't know what to do with it. I left it on the step and went for a short walk around the property perimeter. I didn't go far. I was too rattled. I checked for any signs of people, no camps, no footprints, no trash. Just trees, moss, and silence. That night, I moved the figure inside. I don't know why. Maybe I thought if I kept it with me, whoever put it there wouldn't come back. I propped it up near the window and kept the fire going. I remember watching the shadows move across the walls from the flames. Everything creaked louder that night. I stayed awake listening. At one point, I heard something soft tapping the back wall. It was irregular, like a branch swaying in the wind, but too deliberate. Tap, pause, tap, tap. I didn't move. I just listened. Eventually, it stopped. In the morning, I found fresh marks in the dirt behind the cabin. Not footprints this time, drag marks like something heavy had been pulled through the pine needles and dirt. I followed them for about 30 feet, where they suddenly stopped. No sign of what caused it. Nothing. I decided I'd had enough. I packed up everything. Took less than an hour. I was ready to hike back to the access road and call someone to come pick me up. When I turned to lock the cabin, I saw another figure on the windowsill. A second one. Smaller. Thinner. It hadn't been there earlier. I didn't even touch it. I left the cabin door unlocked and started walking. I didn't stop to eat, barely drank. I just walked, retracing the route I had taken 3 days earlier. I had saved a GPS breadcrumb trail on my old hiking watch. By late afternoon, I reached the gravel road. I sat there for over an hour until a truck came by. I flagged it down and got a ride back into town. I didn't report it. What could I say? I didn't want to answer questions or have people think I imagined things. I developed the photos of the prints and the first carved figure. They came out clear enough. I kept them in a drawer at home. I never looked at them again after that first day. A few months later, I checked the listing for that cabin out of curiosity. It had been removed. I called the rental agency, and they said they stopped offering it after a series of unusual complaints from other renters. They didn't elaborate. I didn't push. That experience changed something in me. I still hike, still camp, but never alone and never too deep into the woods. I still think about those figures, who made them, what they meant, and why they showed up around me. I don't have answers, just the memory of that silence, that tapping, and the feeling of being watched. I wish I could forget it, but I know it'll stay with me for the rest of my life. That cabin was just an old building in the woods. But something or someone was out there, something human enough to leave footprints, but strange enough to never be seen. And that's what makes it worse. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a monster. It was real. I had been putting off the trip for months. Life in the city had turned into a cycle of noise, stress, and sleepless nights. I needed a reset, something quiet, far away, without phones or email or the dull buzz of traffic outside my window. A friend from work had once mentioned an old family cabin deep in the woods of northern Minnesota, a place I could use whenever I wanted. It had no internet, barely any cell service, and was miles from the nearest gas station. It sounded perfect. I took a week off, packed enough food and gear for 7 days, and loaded up my SUV. I left before sunrise, driving north through long, empty highways until the trees started thickening and the roads began to narrow. Eventually, pavement gave way to dirt, and the GPS lost its mind. I followed the written directions my friend gave me, turning off onto an overgrown 2-track trail marked only by a rusted mailbox with no number on it. The path twisted through dense woods, bumping over rocks and roots until I finally saw the outline of the cabin. It was small, 1 story with a steep tin roof, a chimney on one side, and a covered porch barely holding together. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The windows were dusty but intact, and the wood siding was weathered to a dull gray. There was no driveway, just a clearing wide enough to park, surrounded by thick pine trees and tall grass that swayed gently in the breeze. No neighbors, no sounds beyond the birds and wind, and a heavy stillness that hung in the air like fog. I killed the engine and just sat there for a while, letting the silence soak in. Inside, it was about what I expected. A small kitchen with a propane stove, a short hallway leading to a bedroom with a twin bed, a bathroom with a composting toilet, and a main room with a wood stove, a couple of chairs, and a table. The furniture was basic, worn but solid. There was a musky smell, old wood, dust, and faint mildew, but nothing unbearable. I opened the windows to let some air in and started unpacking. The only light came from old oil lamps and a couple of battery-powered lanterns. No TV, no radio, just me and the woods. The first day passed quickly. I spent the afternoon cleaning up a bit, checking the shed behind the cabin for firewood and tools. There was a stack of split logs, some dull axes, and a couple of rusty traps hanging on the wall. I had no plans to hunt or fish. I just wanted to relax, hike around, maybe read a book or two. I made a simple dinner, wrote in a notebook for a while, and went to bed early. The mattress was thin, the blanket scratchy, but I didn't mind. I was out cold within minutes, surrounded by total silence. The next morning, I woke up just after sunrise and went for a walk through the woods. The trails weren't marked, but there were a few paths worn into the forest floor. I followed one that led away from the cabin and deeper into the trees, moving slowly, listening to the birds and the crunch of dry leaves under my boots. The forest was dense and quiet, sunlight filtering through the canopy in thin beams. After about an hour, I found a small creek and sat there for a while, watching the water trickle over rocks. Everything felt calm, peaceful. On the way back, I took a different route and ended up approaching the cabin from the opposite direction. As I got closer, something made me stop. From about 30 yards out, I could see my cabin clearly through the trees, but something was off. The door was closed, but I could swear I left it open. I was sure of it. I'd gone out in a hurry, and it was propped open with a piece of firewood when I left. I stood there for a minute listening. Nothing, just wind. Still, I felt a cold little spike of unease. I approached slowly, checking around the porch, then the windows. Nothing looked disturbed. The door was shut but not locked. I stepped inside and immediately felt strange. Everything looked the same, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been inside. The air felt different, like it had been moved. I checked all the rooms. Nothing missing, no signs of entry, but I still felt watched. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every creak in the wood, every whisper of wind against the cabin made me sit up. I told myself I was being paranoid, that it was just the contrast from the city. Being alone in a remote place like this messed with your head. But when I finally did drift off, I woke up again around 2 a.m. to the sound of something moving outside. Not a deer, heavier than that. I lay there, holding my breath, listening to what sounded like slow footsteps just outside the bedroom wall. Then they stopped. I stayed still for nearly an hour before I passed out from exhaustion. The next morning, I looked around outside. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing, but it didn't feel right anymore. I wanted to leave, but I told myself it was just nerves, that I needed to give it more time. I stayed close to the cabin all day, stacking firewood, organizing gear, trying to keep busy. But I kept looking over my shoulder. Every now and then, I thought I saw movement between the trees. Quick shapes, nothing clear. I chalked it up to nerves and shadow. That night, I locked the cabin door. Not that it would stop anyone determined to get in, and kept the lantern close. I barely slept. Around midnight, I heard the footsteps again. This time they were slower, closer, circling the cabin. I turned off the lamp and sat in the dark, heart racing. After a few minutes, I heard a dull thud, something knocking gently against the porch. Then nothing. I stayed frozen in place for hours until first light crept in through the window. I opened the door slowly and stepped onto the porch. On the top step was a single boot print, larger than mine, worn deep into the damp wood. Someone had been there, no doubt about it. It wasn't an animal, it was human, but the print didn't lead anywhere, just one. No trail, no path of entry or exit, just a boot print and empty woods. That morning, I made the decision to leave early. I packed everything as fast as I could, stuffing my gear into the SUV. I didn't eat. I didn't even check the cabin one last time. I just got in and drove. The trail out felt longer than I remembered, and every time the trees closed in or the path dipped out of sight, I thought I'd see someone standing in the road. But I didn't. I got back to paved roads by late afternoon and drove straight to a gas station 2 towns over. I used their bathroom, grabbed a coffee, and sat at a table for a while, just staring at the people around me. Noise and movement felt strange again, but I was glad to have them. That night, I stayed in a motel. I didn't tell anyone what happened, not even my friend who owned the cabin. I just said it wasn't for me. Too quiet, too isolated. I didn't want to sound paranoid, but deep down, I knew what I felt out there. Someone had been watching me, maybe more than once, and they knew exactly where I was and how far away help would be. Weeks went by, and I tried to forget about it. But one night, I got a text from an unknown number. No message, just a photo. It was my SUV, parked in front of the cabin, taken from the edge of the woods. I hadn't taken that picture, and no one else knew I was there. I changed my number. I moved to a different apartment. I never went back. But sometimes, when I walk alone or hear footsteps behind me on a quiet street, I feel it again. That same heavy silence, that sense of being watched by someone just out of sight. I know I'll never really shake it, because someone out there knows I came, and they wanted me to know they were there too. And maybe next time they won't just leave a footprint.